The state of RAM prices and the outlook for the next 2 years aren't promising at all. So you'll either have to pay a serious amount of extra money or manage with your current PC for a while longer. In this video, I'll talk about how to keep your current PC alive for a bit longer and how to bring your aging computer back to life. If you're ready, let's begin. Some things I say in this video will apply to laptops as well. However, remember that this will vary depending on your laptop model. Let's start with our first main topic, hardware analysis. What I'm going to explain here are generally topics that can create a serious jump in performance but are also costly. If your computer isn't suitable for this, unfortunately, there isn't much you can do. Current minimum requirements. Don't worry, even though I've said things like that in the past, due to today's market, I won't say spoiled things like you must stay away from GPUs with less than 8GB VRAM here. I'll talk about the absolute lowest usable level today. To avoid throwing you down a rabbit hole, I'll specifically stay away from technical details, so you don't need to panic if you don't know much about computers. My goal here is to meet the minimum requirements to run games, rather than lofty goals like opening the game at ultra settings. For simple use cases like web browsing, you can lower some of these criteria. CPU. The rule for CPUs is simple. The more modern, the better. You can understand this most easily by looking at the processor's release date. A more modern processor generally offers higher performance with lower power consumption. The next thing to look at is the core count. For today, I recommend aiming for a minimum of 4 cores, and if possible, 6 cores or more. You can think of this as a sort of segmentation. Motherboard. Go for well-known brands as much as possible for the motherboard. Asus, ASRock, MSI, and Gigabyte are brands you can trust in this regard. The most important reason for this is that they offer BIOS updates regularly and reliably. These updates can increase performance, expand hardware support, and solve existing problems. You need to stay further away from no-name brands or brands that don't manage the BIOS well. Another important point is that the motherboard has enough slots and ports. Details like RAM slots, M.2 SSD, SATA, and USB ports are critical here. This number is directly related to how modern your current build is. For example, old motherboards don't have M.2 support. Although these may seem unimportant at first, they can severely restrict you when the time comes. So it's useful to pay attention to this when buying. If you're going to build a PC from scratch with a very low budget, target LGA 1700 or AM4 platforms as much as possible. Choose the LGA 1200 only as a last resort, as anything below this enters the mega budget level. To avoid confusing you, I'll talk about all compatibility issues later in the video. Graphics card. When it comes to the GPU, we have to accept that it all comes down to price. That's why it's unfortunately very easy to render what I say here useless. On the NVIDIA side, the current series is RTX 5000. If you're going to game, try not to go below the GTX 1000 and GTX 1600 series. If you have a very tight budget, the most logical point in terms of price performance is still the RTX 2000 series. On the AMD side, the naming scheme is unfortunately quite complex. The lowest level you should go for is the RX 588GB. If you're able to get a good deal, the RX 6000 series is still considered powerful and recent enough. However, the RX 5000 series is a bit problematic due to some chronic issues, so you definitely need to do good research before buying. Intel GPUs are generally modern but weak on the efficiency side. We can encounter problems like software issues, high temperatures, and high power consumption. The best example of this is the Arc A750. In the newer Arc B580 models, most of these problems have mostly been resolved. Another critical topic in GPU selection is VRAM. On a low budget, you need to go for at least 6GB. If you can go up to 8GB, prioritize that. Anything above 8GB is something that needs to be evaluated based on the card's price and the GPU's power. Another topic is AIB brands. These brands modify GPUs with different cooling solutions and offer them for sale. Model quality can vary seriously depending on the series and the GPU used. I won't go into detail here as there are specific videos about this on the channel. You can get detailed info there if you're curious. Generally, I recommend avoiding no-name brands. You can trust the brands I'm showing on the screen right now. Storage. Nowadays, hard disks should only be chosen for data storage purposes. You don't even want to know how sluggish they make the operating system. SATA or M.2 SSDs have become the standard now. If you're dealing with very old PCs, prioritize SATA SSDs. Even if your budget is very limited, try to find a 120GB SATA SSD. You'll thank me after installing Windows on it. Modern games really take up too much space. That's why you should have at least 500 GB, preferably 1 TB of storage space. If you have nothing to do with games and you mostly do light usage, even 250 gigabytes of storage might be enough for you. So this part depends entirely on your personal usage. RAM. If the computer you own has 4 gigabytes of RAM, I can safely say that it's mandatory to go up to 8 gigabytes. 16 gigabytes is the best amount for most users and where the difference is felt the most. I'd say anything above that is unnecessary for most users, especially considering current RAM prices. CPU cooler. If the processor you're using has heating issues, you should get rid of the stock fan and switch to a better cooler, because when the CPU gets hot, it throttles its performance to protect itself and tries to cool down that way. However, some processors still work just fine with the stock fan. Most CPU coolers that are better than the stock fan will be more than enough for daily use and gaming. PSU. Since the PSU is the part that provides power to the PC, stay away from old and worn-out products. You should lean towards current models from known brands. The wattage here changes based on the build's power needs. If you want to invest a bit in the future, I recommend buying a high-quality PSU of at least 550 watts. If your budget allows you to go up to 750 watts, that would be even better for you. So, which of these parts should you prioritize when upgrading? Here, the PC you have is the #1 factor. Assuming you have a PC that's weak in every aspect, I prepared this roadmap you'll see on the screen. If one of the stages here is already at a sufficient level, you can skip it. However, before that, you need to know the things that might prevent you from making these upgrades. The biggest criterion in compatibility and the skeleton of the build is the motherboard. This is the part that directly determines how modern a build you can set up and how many extra parts you can plug into the PC. The first thing you need to pay attention to is the socket, as the CPU and motherboard must have the same one. For example, if you choose a motherboard with an old socket like LGA1151, you are limited only to processors belonging to that socket. If you're going to use platforms that have been on the market for a long time, like AM4 or LGA1700, you often need to do a BIOS update. Thanks to this update, you can run CPUs released later on that motherboard without issues as long as they have the same socket. The DDR4 and DDR5 distinction works with the same logic. A DDR4 RAM can only be used with a DDR4 motherboard, and a DDR5 RAM can only be used with a DDR5 motherboard. Another important topic is the number of ports and slots. Not having enough SATA and M2 slots creates a serious obstacle when you want to increase your storage in the future. The number of RAM slots can restrict you in the same way. Form factor refers to the physical size of the motherboard. If your case doesn't support your motherboard's form factor, you can't physically install that motherboard. In laptops, the situation is a bit more limited. Some models may have extra RAM and SSD slots, while others have none. Never forget that laptops always have more limited upgrade options. Another part is the PSU. The PSU needs to stably provide the wattage value the PC needs. This is essential for both the healthy operation of the PC and for your peace of mind. After that, what you need to look at are the cables coming out of the PSU. Especially if you want to modernize your build, you might be seriously restricted due to missing or insufficient power cables. Next is the wattage calculation. You should calculate the maximum power consumption of the parts in the build and choose a PSU by definitely adding a tolerance margin on top. For example, if your build draws 340 watts under the heaviest load, then at least a 400-watt PSU is required. However, if the price difference isn't much, it would be more logical for you to get a PSU of 550 watts and above. This both sets the ground for any upgrade plans you might make in the future and prevents the PSU from constantly working under full load. Another part is RAM. I previously mentioned that only DDR4 RAMs can be installed on DDR4 motherboards. Aside from this, RAMs used in laptops and RAMs used in desktop PCs are different from each other. That's where finding compatible RAM comes into play. If you install memory very different from the specs of the existing RAM in the build, you may experience incompatibility issues. So either choose memory of the same brand and model, or choose RAMs with technical specs very close to each other. This one's a bit of a detailed topic, but I need to briefly mention it. While using 4 channels or sticks of RAM on the DDR4 side is relatively problem-free, I recommend staying away from this as much as possible on DDR5. In DDR5, as the number of channels increases, stability can deteriorate seriously, and you might need to significantly lower RAM speeds to keep the build stable. Storage is a bit of a weirder topic. Some old laptops have a CD-ROM drive. By removing this part, a SATA SSD or a 2.5-inch HDD can be installed in its place. If you want to bring your laptop back to life, installing a SATA SSD here is mandatory. In desktop PCs, the point to pay attention to most is the M.2 slot. Some motherboards have only a single M.2 slot. If you want to increase storage space in the future, you may need to use SATA SSDs, HDDs, or converter solutions. In summary, if you are going to update your current PC hardware-wise, you absolutely need to take these into consideration. But the job doesn't end here. Treating your PC well is just as important as the hardware. So let's talk a bit about this now. Maintenance and organization. If you don't care about your PC, it won't care about you either, and it won't perform as well as it possibly could. Therefore, regardless of your computer's age, you must perform maintenance on it at certain intervals. Stage 1. Thermal maintenance. Thermal paste, thermal pads, and dust cleaning directly affect cooling performance. This means getting rid of performance drops caused by heat. This topic is much more important in laptops. In desktop PCs, thermal paste and thermal pads can be changed every 2 to 3 years. For dust cleaning, a light cleaning every 3 months and a detailed cleaning 1 to 2 times a year is sufficient. In laptops, I recommend dust maintenance twice a year depending on the model. Thermal paste and pads should be changed every 1 to 2 years, again, depending on the model. However, if there are serious temperature problems, these operations can also be done more frequently. Another topic frequently skipped in desktop PCs is airflow and cable management. Messy cables prevent air from circulating freely inside the case. Airflow is about adjusting the blowing directions of the fans correctly. Hot air must be evacuated from the case without creating turbulence. Just paying attention to these 2 issues can drop the temperatures by up to 10 degrees in some cases. Stage 2. Cleaning up after the operating system. You need to clean up junk files accumulated over the years, application leftovers, and similar unnecessary data 1 to 2 times a year. This topic is a separate video subject in itself, but you're lucky because there's a detailed video on the channel exactly about this. I don't want to extend the topic and go into too much detail here. If it interests you, I recommend you watch that video. Stage 3. Where you place the PC. This is perhaps the weirdest, but also the most ignored stage. Try not to put your desktop PC in a narrow and enclosed space. This leads to dust accumulating faster, heat not being expelled from the case, and temperatures generally rising. As a result, the time between thermal maintenance shortens and performance drops faster. In laptops, specifically avoid soft surfaces. If the fans can't pull enough air, the cooling system, which is already very limited, becomes completely dysfunctional. If possible, keep the laptop a few centimeters above the ground. You can use laptop stands or cooler pads for this. This way, you won't block the airflow and will preserve cooling performance. So is that all? Unfortunately, no. No matter how powerful or weak your hardware is, you need to support your hardware with proper usage on the software side. This brings us to our last main topic, software and usage style. What you'll do here is either very cheap or completely free. Also, these are the real things keeping aging PCs alive without messing with its internals. Operating system choice. We often forget what a problematic and resource-wasteful piece of software Windows is. That's why the choice you make here can really create a big difference in terms of performance. If you have a very old computer, even using Windows 7 instead of Windows 10 can create a noticeable difference. Its RAM requirements are lower and it's lighter in general. Yes, there are program compatibility issues, but if you lack hardware power and don't want lag, you might have to make this trade-off. Alternative Windows versions might also work for you. For example, Windows 10 LTSC is a simpler and more stable version where unnecessary apps are not present. It offers only the core operating system and receives security updates. This way, it consumes fewer hardware resources. However, remember that it might cause compatibility issues in some programs and games. If you are really stubborn about getting maximum efficiency from an aging PC, you can switch to Linux. Let me say it from the start, it's not for everyone. Its interface might be harder compared to Windows. You usually need to find solutions to problems by researching, and program compatibility is more selective, especially if you like playing games with anti-cheat software. Moreover, you need to choose the Linux distribution that suits you best, which can be puzzling for newcomers. However, in return for all these efforts, you gain a lot. Freedom in the operating system, absence of anything you don't need, more efficient use of hardware power, much rarer viruses, strong community support, and serious advantages in some lines of work, like development. Free performance boosters. Turning on XMP or Expo, deleting unnecessary apps, and changing the power plan are steps that do no harm and are must-dos. Since I touched on these topics in detail in the video I mentioned just a moment ago, I don't want to repeat myself here. Don't forget to watch it after this video. Driver update. Components like the motherboard and graphics card have drivers. Keeping these up to date can solve some problems in the build and directly gain you performance. so don't neglect updates. However, you must definitely do this process through the brand's own official site. Automatic driver downloader programs might install the wrong driver or infect the PC with a virus, so stay away from them. Review game settings. When trying to bring your PC back to life, the last thing you should care about is graphics. That's why lowering settings is often the most logical solution. However, on an average PC, if you want to get the best image with the highest FPS, things get a bit complicated. You might get drowned among settings like tessellation, ambient occlusion, and anti-aliasing, and experience serious FPS loss due to a wrong choice. I have a special guide on the channel for this topic. If you want to intervene knowing what the settings do, I definitely recommend you watch that video. Lossless scaling, Magpie, and integer scaler. These programs run the game at a lower resolution and scale the image afterward, reducing the load on the GPU. In return, you experience some image quality loss, but you can get a smoother gaming experience. If you normally get above 30 FPS and set these programs up correctly, they can manage you for a while longer. I can say it's a quite useful method, especially for those who lower settings to the minimum to get FPS on bad PCs. Finally, overclock. Why am I saying this when there is an entire video on the channel with the message, "Don't overclock"? Because old processors can actually get incredible boosts from overclocking. In those times, manufacturers left much wider tolerances, and it was possible to increase frequencies by over 35%. Nowadays, CPUs come off the production line almost squeezed dry. Not much tolerance is left, and often it's not worth the trouble. Before closing the video, I want to commemorate these greatest of all-time processors. These are processors that were wonderful in their time and have a very separate place for me. Now that I've commemorated these processors, we can now end the video. Which of these recommendations do you plan to carry out after this video? Don't forget to leave your plans and experiences here in the comments. If you liked the video, don't forget to hit the like button. If not, feel free to dislike it. Stay mysterious until the next video. Take care and bye.